If you're gonna do CGI, it needs to be at like 60 frames per second or close to it.
It's not that simple. Higher numbers usually don't translate to better looking footage. Here, let me give you an example. Beastars is probably the CG anime that everyone likes the most, the one that everyone believes looks the best. What frame rate do you think that Beastars runs at? 60 frames per second? 30 frames per second? Not even close. Try 12 frames per second at most and 8 frames per second at least. Beastars doesn't look good because its frame rate is high, it looks good because they consider the frame rate as an artistic choice. Land of the Lustrous is the exact same way. The highest its frame rate goes is 24 frames per second. But it often dips much lower. Advent Children, which is considered a pretty good CGI movie for video game fans, runs somewhere between 12 and 24 frames per second, with the exception of certain frame increases for some battle scenes. Most good CGI runs at low but variable frame rates. In fact, Arc System Works, the creators of Guilty Gear, realized that their animation looked better when they lowered the frame rate to make it closer to traditional animation than when they ran it higher and made it run more like computer animation. Now, Ajin runs at 10 frames per second, and it runs at 10 frames per second throughout its whole runtime. That's one of the problems. All of Ajin runs at the same frame rate regardless of scene, regardless of action. The second problem is how they composited Ajin. They animated Ajin in full 3D and then just reduced the frame rate to something that looked cinematic. But all those other examples that I gave you, Beastars, Land of the Lustrous, Guilty Gear, so on and so forth, they were animated differently. They were animated closer to traditional animation. Which is to say, frames were composited in 3D, much as like they were being drawn on a canvas. Each frame was being set up to express something. It wasn't a 3D animation that was then slowed down, it was an animation that was composited of individual 3D frames. And that makes a big difference. Because the smooth movement you see from 60 frames per second video games happens because the computer is interpreting a set of instructions. It's interpreting where the character is and what they're doing, and creates an animation routine from it. That's good for being responsive, but it's really bad for looking expressive and cinematic. That's because animations are being run on routine. There's more focus on the keyframes. Good cinematic 3D animation treats it as if it were traditional animation. Which is to say, they create the keyframes and they draw the in-betweens and so on and so forth, but they do it all with 3D software. And that tends to be the separating factor. Good CGI anime tends to have more frames composited as if they were hand-drawn frames. Whereas bad CGI anime works more like a video game. A whole animation routine is run and they just slow down the frame rate. The more individual work is put into each frame, the better the anime looks.